Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today for our very first talk as part of the Science Communication Education Research Network. Our network is part of an NSF Coordination Award aimed at improving science communication education through research and practice. We bring together scholars and practitioners from education, sciences, and communications disciplines to exchange knowledge on the ways to improve the future of science communication. We're particularly focused on building the field of science communication education and establishing effective training for the next generation of science communicators. We hope that our network can help address some of the challenges we've been experiencing as scientists, educators, and researchers, and we are so glad you chose to take time today in the midst of everything. Today, we are incredibly excited to introduce as our first speaker from the Kelp lab, Dr. Nicole Kelp, who is an assistant professor at Colorado State University, where she holds joint appointments in the Department of Microbiology, Immunology, and Pathology, as well as the University of Colorado School of Medicine and the Colorado School of Public Health. Her research group studies health communication about infectious diseases and how to teach the next generation of scientists to communicate more effectively. Today, she will be presenting with two of her lab members, Hannah Gillard, who just completed her undergraduate degree, and Jasmine Donka, who contributed to the Kelp Lab while a graduate student at CSU and now is an assistant teaching professor at George Washington University. But before we get started, since one of our main goals is to connect researchers and practitioners across disciplines, we're going to facilitate a quick connection point for those in attendance. We're going to ask you to join a breakout room of 2 to 3 people and introduce yourself. Please just take 30 seconds to say your name, your current position and affiliation, and why you decided to attend this talk today. We're only going to be in rooms for 90 seconds, so this will be a quick connection. When we come back, Dr. Kelp and her lab will begin their presentation. Nicole, you can go ahead and share your screen now. All right, I think we are all back. So Nicole, go ahead and take it away.
Thank you. So as Liz mentioned, I'll be talking a bit, but also Hannah and Jazz, who either currently or formerly worked in my lab, will also be providing some of their insights. And we will also be doing some poll questions throughout, as well as one more breakout. So we really hope to have some engagement from folks as you are able. So we are going to actually start with a poll because I want to really quickly know who all is here. I know you just shared with each other. But Erin, if you could put up the poll, if you are able to do so. Amazing, thank you. Okay, I'm seeing most folks have answered. So we've got some theory nerds in here. So I really look forward to people's insights. Near the end, I'll be presenting a few theories that we use in our research, but I'm excited to hear from others. And we've got a really great mix of we've got some science education, like deeper type folks, but also some folks from SciComm, as well as some science educators and researchers. So a really great mix of people in the audience. So I hope we learn from each other throughout the time. Thanks for running that poll, Erin. Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about why we're talking about theory today. So ideally, theory should inform our research and our practice in science communication. But unfortunately, there's a lot of breakdowns in this integration, and this has actually been highlighted really recently in a special issue in the Journal of Science Communication, or JCOM, that came out last year, where the kind of the editorial, which I believe Aaron will be putting the link to this in the chat if you guys are interested in reading this special issue, calls out that there's this disconnect between science communication research that's often very theory-based and science communication practice that often might be disconnected from the research, and some of the challenges that are brought up, or sometimes the researchers are so in the theory and methods that that whatever the findings are aren't practically applicable, or practitioners don't have the resources to connect with the theory and evidence and research. So multiple challenges. But what I appreciate about this collection and this special issue is that some solutions were called out, and one potential way to bridge, for example, research and practice is science communication education. So I think those of us who engage in science communication education have this really great opportunity that's been identified in the field as the teachers or educators or trainers in science communication could kind of be the bridges between what is the new evidence by science communication researchers who are developing and building theory and evidence, and how can we apply that to practice. And that takes collaboration. This other article talks about how theory and practice could be bridged with better collaboration. And so that is why I really appreciate this network, and everyone attending this talk now is we need people in different kind of specialties or with different professional identities working together. We can't be in these silos within science communication work. So given that, what are some theories that are used in science communication and science communication education research, and how can we use these in both kind of research and practitioner applications? And the first one I'm going to talk about is the theory of planned behavior. So this was originally developed back in the 80s and 90s by Asgen, and what we can see here in the kind of simple version is that someone's attitude, someone's attitude towards a behavior, their subjective norms, which means what they think others around them that they appreciate and respect and trust think about that behavior. So what do their colleagues or friends or family think about that behavior? And then perceived behavioral control, which is, do I think I can do it? I might think this is a great thing to do, but if I don't think I can personally do it, I don't have that type of confidence or self-efficacy, I won't do it. So all of these need to work together to inform our intentions and whatever behavior we do. And this is based kind of on an expectancy value theory framework. So what do we value about that behavior? And that's kind of in the attitudes and a bit in the norms. And then do we expect that we can do it? And the nice thing about theory of planned behavior for science communication is we can look at the behavior of ourselves as science communicators, and I'll talk about some of the literature highlighting the use of this theory in that type of investigation, but we can also look at the behavior of the people we're talking with or communicating to, our audiences. And so we could examine, oh, if I want to talk with audiences about a behavior like getting a vaccine, for instance, I might engage with them about their attitudes towards vaccination or their norms around vaccination. So this works because we can use this theory to understand both our behavior as science communicators and the behavior of our audiences. And theory of planned behavior has been expanded. And so I'm not going to expect you to become an expert on all these potential constructs, but that kind of simplified version of attitudes, norms, and perceived behavioral control here is the integrated behavior model, which is kind of an expansion of theory of planned behavior along with something called theory of reasoned action. You can see we still have attitudes, norms, and here they term perceived behavioral control as like agency or self-efficacy, but all of that is still going to inform intentions. But there's multiple components of each of those bigger constructs, depending on kind of different formulations of this root theory of planned behavior. So let's look at theory of planned behavior, or the more expanded version of integrated behavior model in science communication. And a couple authors, if you're not familiar with them, that I'd highly recommend you engage with their work, who do a lot in this kind of field of science communication training, are John Besley and Anthony Dudo. And if you really, for those of you who are theory nerds, which seems like a majority of the audience, this article is a theory-based approach to studying what kind of behaviors science communicators do. And so this is a great article about theory, and I'll bring up just a couple of tables from this article. They really look at what type of behaviors are we choosing, and we need to think strategically about what these planned behaviors should be in terms of theory planned behaviors. So they conceptualize that we have to have communication goals understood as behaviors. And so these can be concrete or abstract. But we should have a goal for our science communication, I think is a key lesson that is highlighted by using theory of planned behavior. I think sometimes we think simply of, oh, I need to communicate about my science, maybe to inform people or maybe to persuade people. But those are very different goals, and how I communicate should be different under those different instances. Based on my goal, I can come up with objectives. So if, for example, I want to persuade someone I'm talking to get vaccinated, for example, which is often a communication goal for like a health communication campaign, I can then think about, if that's a behavioral goal for my audience, what beliefs should or attitudes should I be talking about? What norms should I be talking about? And also, should I have any behavioral goals for myself as well as my audience? And then based on those objectives, I can back up to what type of tactics work the best. I think too often we jump into science communication tactics without thinking of the goals first that should inform those. And finally, in this article, they take that integrated behavior model, which is based on theory of planned behavior, along with something called the integrated model of organizational trust, which I think is a key component to add here, that if we are communicating with people and we are thinking about their attitudes, norms, and agency to do a behavior, as well as our attitudes, norms, and agency towards an approach for communication, we need to have trust between ourselves and our audience. And also maybe with our colleagues, we need to, if we're trying a new communication goal or trying to engage with a new community, we need to have trust in our motives, and our colleagues need to have trust in our motives. And so thinking about trust as kind of overarching along with these behaviors is very helpful. What does that look like? So I started a little theory. Let's talk about how is that applied into the research and education space. And so utilizing this model, researchers, including all of these are papers from Besley and Dudo and colleagues, they can look at what are the different behavioral goals that communicators have, and why do scientists choose different tactics, and are they willing to choose those tactics, and if not, why? We can talk about different fields, for example, basic scientists or ecologists, and what are the types of behavioral goals that people might choose when communicating about those fields. And then we can look at specific constructs within these theories. So in this article, for example, they looked at attitudes versus norms versus self-efficacy towards community engagement and listening to community perspectives. And here they saw that attitudes and seeing a benefit of listening community perspectives guided whether or not people did it. And so that's really important. If we want people to listen to community perspectives, we need to understand why scientists do or don't. I want to highlight, based on all of this, a new framework that some of these practice briefs just came out, I think last week, about how to have effective public engagement. And this framework that Besley and others contributed to, S stands for strategic. And so this whole idea that we should have strategic goals for our science communication and set, that's the first step of this science communication framework here, is I should set behaviors that I want to change as well as behaviors I might want my audience to change. So like I mentioned, theory of planned behavior can look at both your behavior as a communicator as well as behavior of your audience, and setting goals for both of those from the outset could be a really effective way to then go into doing science communication. So I highly recommend folks check out, this is a screenshot from the strategic component of this framework, but as you can believe, E is equitable and R, I think it might be reflective. There's different kind of things that are dug into, but S for strategic kind of builds on this work with theory of planned behavior. What does this look like in science communication education research? And so Heather Aiken, who is on the steering committee for the SCERN network and will be giving this talk in May, has utilized theory of planned behavior quantitatively using constructs from theory of planned behavior in surveys before and after a training of graduate students in science communication. And so we can see, did people's attitudes change or norms or intentions, et cetera. My group, along with my collaboration with Ashley Anderson here at CSU and my graduate student Shelby, used some of the quantitative constructs similar to Aiken's group, but also did qualitative work with theory of planned behavior. We looked at before and after a training. Again, we did interviews and we looked for people's attitudes towards specifically addressing misinformation before and after a training and their perceived behavioral control and how did that change. And so this theory, kind of depending on whether you use theory of planned behavior or a version of it like that integrated behavior model or some of the other derivations, is really helpful for both quantitative or qualitative ways of evaluating science communication trainings. Which will lead me to where I'm going to bring Hannah in to talk a little bit about how our lab developed a scale based on the theory of planned behavior to measure science communication behaviors here, specifically inclusive science communication, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But I'm going to invite Hannah as one of the co-authors of this paper to talk a little bit about how we utilize theory of planned behavior and built a scale. Okay, Hannah, take it away.
So we've got Nicole say that we created this scale to measure how did students plan, do, think with inclusive science communication. And so what we did was how we create this scale was we use previous literature, the theory of planned behavior, and social scientific issues to create a 29 survey item on a 5-point Likert scale response. And again, our 4 hypothesized factors was ISC beliefs, attitudes, norms, ISC self-efficacy, ISC behaviors, ISC behavioral intents. And we did an expert review by grad and undergrad researchers, and then 1 item was excluded for clarity, which led us to a 28-item survey. And so this is an example of one of the factors, self-efficacy, and I'm just going to read 3 of them. And this is how it looked for our undergraduate students that was taking it. So I feel confident learning about social scientific issues from people with diverse expertise and experiences. I feel confident explaining social scientific issues to people with diverse experiences. I feel confident considering diverse perspectives about social scientific issues. And again, they could have did 1, I strongly disagree, all the way from 5, I strongly agree. And so we statistically validated this scale 2 ways. The first one that we did was exploratory factor analysis, so EFA, and that is for us to determine the patterns between the variables and identify relationships between these factors. So our input number was 598 STEM undergraduate students from diverse majors, and the EFA actually returned 5 factors. So 26 of the 28 survey items actually loaded into the 4 factors, and 2 out of the 28 survey items loaded into the 5th factor. So what we did was we excluded 2 items to come up with our 26-item survey and our hypothesized 4 factors. Next, we did confirmatory factor analysis, CFA, and that was just to determine if hypothesized factor structure fits observed data. So the input was 376 STEM undergraduates from diverse majors, and the CFA support a hypothesized factor structure. And so it came up with a 26 survey items loaded into those 4 categories. And so this is actually the CFA path diagram. So as you can see, all the way from question 1 to question 26, what factor they went into. And then in the middle, you have your loading factors, which is how well the survey item fits within the factor. So the closer to 1, the closer the question fit into that factor. Then also between the 4 factors, you can see the little arrows and the number that's pointing to them. That is the covariance. And that just shows what we also hypothesized with the theory of planned behavior is that all of these factors work together to how students will think, plan, and do dealing with inclusive science communication. And so what we want to do, we want to make sure that we could determine if this scale will return expected results in real world setting. So we did a 1-day workshop for first year STEM students about inclusive science communication, and they took this survey before the training and after the training. And in the workshop previously shown an increase in student science communication, identity, and self-efficacy. And so the results from this was that was two things. Was the first thing was that our survey was able to take a decrease after students had this ISC training, that all of their for all of the four factors actually increased, and that the second thing is that students actually benefited from this. So we learned two things: was that our survey worked and that students actually benefited from this training.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hannah. Hannah will be back later to talk about another thing on our lab at the end of the talk. So we've talked about theory of planned behavior here. We've talked about how it can be used qualitatively and quantitatively to measure the effect of training, to analyze why science communicators do or do not choose different behaviors, etc. So Erin is gonna send you guys into a breakout. And I would like you to ask the question, how could you apply this theory of planned behavior or some of the related theories like integrated behavior management to your science communication research or teaching? And then talk in your groups, and then maybe one or two people would love to hear you share out to the larger group when you come back. All right. So as I mentioned, I know that was a really quick breakout, but I would love to hear from one or two people who might want to share any ideas you had or someone in your breakout room had. Feel free to put in the chat or unmute, whichever you might feel more comfortable with.
Okay, I guess I'll just jump in because it's quiet and makes me uncomfortable at the moment. I think that one of the things that what came from our short discussion was intentionality. Knowing about these different factors goes into planned behavior, provides a greater intentionality to what you're doing because you have something to grab on. And it's true both in our teachings and training, but also in the way we introduce science communication to our students.
Eric, thank you so much. I think intentionality is so important, and the idea of planning. And just for time, we didn't talk through this, but in the project that Hannah was part of that she just shared about, we did some focus groups with students about the survey. And that was one thing that came up in those focus groups was students saying like, oh, I don't tend to like plan my science communication, never thought about doing that. And this idea that the literature shows us that having planning or strategy behind our science communication is really necessary. So I think that's a really great point and something that I think we can all focus on more because our students don't intuitively think to do that. Awesome. And then I see Rihanna, I think I'm pronouncing it correctly, I hope, talked about using theory of planned behavior as a framework for teaching science communication as well as evaluating. I think it's a great idea. Any of these frameworks by which we understand ourselves or our audiences are a great way to teach science communication. Thank you guys for your ideas. For the sake of time, I'm going to talk about our kind of second theoretical framework that we're really going to dig into, which is the idea of inclusive science communication. And this has been kind of conceptualized in a few different ways, but I'm going to utilize these key traits, which come from the Metcalf Institute at the University of Rhode Island, and they run the Inclusive SciComm conference every couple of years. And this has now been published in a few different places that these key traits of inclusive science communication are intentionality, also built on what Eric was mentioning a second ago, reciprocity, and reflexivity. So intentionality is that we have to intentionally consider our audience, both our identities and the identities in our audience, and who is and isn't represented, that we aren't going to have more effective, participatory, collaborative, inclusive, whatever word you want to use, science communication by accident. It will only happen intentionally. Reciprocity, which is the idea that we need to have co-creation of science and science communication, both with traditional scientists as well as members of communities or other experts, and we should value varied forms of expertise. And then finally, reflexivity, which is the idea that as researchers, as communicators, as scientists, we must reflect in our identities, our practice, our motives, our outcomes, and then notice where things might be inequitable or ineffective and adjust that. So inclusive science communication is at kind of one end of a spectrum, and there's a lot of different models of science communication that have been described in the literature. And so this figure our lab has summarized in a paper, which Jazz is going to talk a little bit more about the research in that paper shortly. But as you can see in the top, in the science communication literature, kind of depending on the author or how it was theorized, science communication has been split between traditional or kind of newer public participation paradigms. And sometimes that's divided into 3 categories, some into 4, but it's all along the spectrum from this inclusive model at one end, where there's a network of people deliberating and sharing and making decisions together, to something at the other end that is often kind of a deficit approach, where the scientist is sharing settled science with a non-expert audience. And then somewhere in the middle, maybe we have some dialogue, but it's still really centering science and the scientist as opposed to this more inclusive model. So how does inclusive science communication show up in science communication literature and research? There's a great kind of focus recently in science communication research where the identities of science communicators have really been explored. And it shows that, so for example, graduate students feel that science communication is a place they belong, especially if they have identities that are not represented in kind of traditional science spaces, and that these scientists are focusing on their own identities and how that is helping them in connection in science communication with their audiences. And we aren't talking about it today for the sake of time, but some work I've done with undergraduates that's been really exciting is when I teach inclusive approaches to science communication, where we talk about, hey, diverse perspectives and different backgrounds matter and help make science better when it's looked at from new directions and new perspectives. That helps students not only think about the diverse perspectives of their audience, but also of themselves. And we have data showing that students from first-generation backgrounds or immigrant backgrounds or some of these other different life experiences recognize, oh, if we're saying that diverse experiences and perspectives matter to make the science better, that means my diverse experience and perspective matters to make the science better. So when we utilize science communication from this inclusive approach, it not only helps connect with our audiences and communities better, but it also helps connect with members of the scientific community who haven't traditionally been welcomed and have been more excluded. So I think that's a really exciting angle at looking at not only the audience, the identities of audiences we're talking with, but also our own. And so I'm going to hand it over to Jasmine to talk about a study our lab did a couple of years ago, looking at, okay, if inclusive science communication is better and more effective, is it being used to train STEM students or not? And so Jasmine, I'm going to hand it over to you to talk through this work.
All right. Thank you, Nicole. Yeah, so as Nicole literally just mentioned, this was kind of an idea of how is this inclusive science communication framework applied to what we are teaching students in like the whole broad spectrum of STEM, not just students, but also scientists. So the project that I was involved of 3 years ago was a literature review done by me as well as other students in the lab, looking at published science communication articles and kind of where do they fall around this framework when they mention science communication training, right? And so also, as Nicole mentioned, science communication falls in the spectrum of deficient, where it's kind of like this one way. We're assuming that our audience doesn't know anything, so we're treating them as a monolith. And I'm just like, I'm the expert. This is exactly what I need to tell you, and you're just going to take it and walk away. We have this dialogue model, which is kind of us talking back and forth, like actually communicating, actually a conversation. And lastly, we have this inclusive model where we take everyone's backgrounds and we value them equally. And we have this whole network of people kind of sharing ideas, and everyone is equitable in that sense. So what the 2 students who, so we found 81 different published articles on science communication trainings. And there are 2 students that coded these articles either by a deficit model, a dialogue model, an inclusive model, broken down by 3 different trainings or like elements. And so here we have one of the many results that were in our paper. And the thing that I want to point out here was, of the 81 published science communication training articles, we have undergraduate students who are trained, graduate students, as well as scientists. And if we look at the breakdown of which ones are inclusive, which ones are dialogue, and which ones are deficient coded, we can see that overwhelmingly undergraduate students are trained in a deficient model way, where it's like you are the expert and you're just talking to your audience and they should listen to you. And only 9% of the published trainings actually included inclusive science communication. So it kind of shows that there's a little bit of a deficit of trainings for undergraduate students in an inclusive way.
Awesome. Thank you, Jasmine. And Jasmine will share a little bit at the end as well. And so we identified this need based on the work that Jasmine and others in the lab contributed to, that especially for our undergraduate STEM students, how do we give them these skills beyond, for example, I'll go back quickly, some of these skills in the deficit model trainings, like removing jargon to talk to a general lay audience, which inherently is not a bad skill, but students are missing some of these other skills for the inclusive model. So how can we add that to our trainings? And one solution is creating science communication lessons focused on communicating about socio-scientific issues. By definition, SSIs are complicated. They're often conceptualized as what's called a wicked problem, meaning that there might not actually be one solution, that people have different values or needs, and different stakeholders in the conversation about these issues need to work together, but sometimes meeting one group's need might hurt another group. And how do we deal with that? And so we need these inclusive approaches to help solve these issues. And so bringing in, helping students not just summarize some sort of kind of settled science to a lay audience. Instead, how would you communicate in a conversation about a current complex issue, either globally or locally, is a way to help students practice some of this inclusive science communication. So I'm going to bring it back to Hannah, who's going to talk about a current project that's happening literally right now. We've got a meeting this coming weekend with the students with helping students think about socio-scientific issues using inclusive science communication. So Hannah, if you want to talk about this program.
Yeah, so the program is called Mentoring and Application Program in Inclusive Science Communication, MAP-ISC as we call it. It is an NSF funded program that's run by the Kelp Lab, and we are on our last cohort. We did a cohort last semester, and so students receive training in ISC theory, research, and practice, and these are undergraduate STEM students. They complete reflections on intentionality, reflectivity, and reciprocity in science communication. They also consider like audience analysis, communication planning, communication evaluation, dealing with ISC. They do also a mini ISC project, so they actually get to practice everything that we taught them and evaluate what that practice looked like for them with this ISC project about social scientific issue. And that integrates that theory, research, and practice in SciComm. And so with our evaluation methods, we have quantitative data, so pre and post using the PBIC scale. So what I talked about a little bit in the beginning. So we get to see how their growth was dealing with ISC, how they practice, how they think, how they incorporate it into their daily lives. And then we also do thematic analysis via collaborative autoethnography. So that means students get to actually be researchers. So that's actually the next part. Not only that they get to do a program dealing with inclusive science communication, they actually get to be a part of their research with us. And so this thing called collaborative autoethnography allows them to do thematic analysis and come up with themes of what their experience was. So not us just looking at and be like, okay, this is what we think we got from your reflections. They actually get to go back and evaluate and actually look at, okay, no, this is what my experience was dealing with the program.
Awesome. Thank you, Hannah. And I'm now going to bring Jasmine back to talk about how do you put this in disciplinary classes. And so that program, the MAP-IC that Hannah just talked about, is a multiple hours extracurricular program. But what about if you're teaching intro, bio, or some other class like that? How can we integrate these concepts of inclusive science communication into the classroom? And so Jazz, who's now in like a teaching professor position, and so thinking about this, is going to talk about plans there. So Jasmine?
So really briefly, this is an idea that I have for a part of a course next semester, Introductory to Microbiology, where students will choose some type of disease that they want to learn about, and instead of end report that's all typed up, it's actually going to be some type of science communication I guess, like projects, so either a podcast or a video. And it's really easy to teach a deficit model of like, here's just how you talk at someone and that's it. So I've been talking to Nicole a little bit about how can we integrate this inclusive science communication type theory. And something that we've come up with is just really incorporate student identities into the project. So first, they should reflect on how their identities might impact how they communicate with the world. And they also need to think about how the identities of their audience should impact how they talk, how they think about science and how they should talk about science. So there's going to be a middle of semester like reflective like element or like worksheet, and then end of semester when they submit their science communication project, either a podcast or a video, they're also going to have to reflect on how they incorporated these perspectives and how that shaped the way that they communicated their science, and even if it did. So at the bottom is just an example. I live in Washington, D.C. There's multiple wards. D.C. is also a historically Black city, and GW is not. And so how would you communicate with someone who has a different background from you? And then how do you talk about that? Or how do you talk about an infectious disease in an area that's endemic to that, area versus something else? So it's really thinking about their bias as well as audience motivation, emotions, and values, and incorporating all of that into this assignment.
Awesome. Thank you, Jasmine. And what I really appreciate about this process as Jasmine and I have been collaborating on it is Jasmine took initially, I want students to do a podcast or video and explain about an infectious disease, which could have ended there and be really good for students to think about, oh, how do I explain for a general audience, but doesn't include some of those inclusive components. So adding this idea of reflecting on identities helps students have some of that more reflexivity and other components of inclusive science communication. And I think this really highlights that if we have a science communication training we've been using that maybe has more of those deficit or dialogue model skills, it doesn't mean we scrap the whole thing. We can think about how to embed inclusive components into that existing project or lesson that we have. And that's something when I look at some of the early science communication training I did, in my previous position, like 7 years ago, it didn't have a lot of these inclusive components, but there was ways we've been incorporating more inclusive components into lessons I used to do. And so I think it's a really kind of to have a growth mindset about this. How do we add some of these components to our trainings? And it can be done in that stepwise way. So I want to grow the field, and I love that we've got a variety of folks here in the audience from science communication, from science education. So I think both of these kind of different fields can come together for science communication education. I think there's, I mentioned, really, we talked about theory of planned behavior and inclusive science communication today because we had 45 minutes, but things about self-efficacy, metacognition, social cognitive theory, et cetera, that we use in science education research all the time, I think can and should be applied to science communication education. And similarly, things like health belief model, social ecological framework, et cetera, can and should be applied to our trainings as well. So you're going to get a final breakout for about 2 minutes. Once again, think about what frameworks did we not talk about today that you wish we had talked about today, or you think you could use in your work, or you're already using your work. And then we'll come back, and I would love a couple people to share out from the breakout rooms. And then we also will have opportunity for just general Q&A as well. So actually, Erin, if you could do 3 minutes for this breakout room to give people a little bit more time to talk, and then we'll come back, share out from this breakout, and then have general Q&A.
I'm also going to post a link in the chat to a Google Doc where people can post major questions that they would like to ask as part of their discussion in the breakout rooms. The breakout rooms will be opening right now.
It's garbage.
Oh, it's truly the worst.
Yeah.
Okay, welcome back. I see people coming in. So I would love, like I said, to have a couple of folks share out from the breakout room any theoretical frameworks you are using or think you are planning to use in the future that we didn't talk about today. Would love to hear folks' ideas.
So one thing that we talked about in our group was how some of the inclusive science communication framework that you talked about reminded them of the deep teaching framework, and the parallel between like having like empathy at the center of that, and how your own identity like influences the way that you communicate. And so that was one thing that I thought was interesting. And then somebody else shared about how that might be particularly important for STEM students, because there's some evidence that maybe at graduating that STEM students might be coming at communication from a less empathetic lens than non-STEM students. And that could come from the way that we're trained, right? So that's what we talked about.
Yeah, I think empathy and how that shows up in different fields is incredibly important. So thank you for sharing that. Mark, I saw your hand up for a minute on Zoom.
Yeah, with Cora and Alberto, we discussed a little bit metacognition and how important it is that the students reflect on their own knowledge and constantly analyze what they have done and how they can improve their conversations with their the publics and their audiences, and also briefly mentioned constructivism. So they are building their own knowledge as they are working through some of these strategic communication projects.
Yeah, thank you. Constructivism and metacognition, just looking at learning theories in general is something, yeah, I've actually started considering as well of how are students learning science communication as this skill? How are they aware of their strengths and weaknesses? Really important. I'm looking in the chat. I see trust building theories. I think all of those interpersonal communication theories, super important. Some of the work we do in science communication is built on some of the larger like health education and health promotion, kind of bigger communication audiences, but that interpersonal trust building is so important. Then I'm reading Rob's post here. Yeah, learning about other perspectives in the room. I think that really highlights that inclusive perspective. Thank you all for sharing. We've got about 10 minutes left in this time, so I just want to open it up to general Q&A or sharing. I definitely, if you have questions, I'm happy to answer them, but would also appreciate Q&A. And Liz, I think that was you talking. Go ahead.
Yes. So we thank you so much, Nicole and team. We are now going to start our Q&A portion of the talk. But to once again further the connections we made and share ideas, we will send you back to your breakout rooms to decide what is one question you would like answered or one takeaway from this talk you would like to share. You can type your question or takeaway in the Google Doc that Erin shared. So if you all want to go ahead and click on that Google Doc link so you don't lose it. And just write a question that your group has. And when we come back in 3 minutes, then Nicole will and colleagues will look at that. And all right, I think that we are back. So Nicole, I saw some good questions there in that Google Doc.
Yeah, we've got 5 minutes and I don't think I could answer all of them. One question I appreciated, it says, do students really need to know the theories itself to communicate science well? Is it sufficient to show them how the theory can be applied effectively? Personally, and if others have other ideas and perspectives, would love to hear it. I find it really helpful to talk about specific theories when I'm talking with my students. So for example, I'm in a microbiology department, so I teach vaccine communication, and I often bring up the health belief model, which is a public health theory outlining how someone's perceived risk from getting a disease and their perceived benefit of getting, for example, a vaccine to prevent that disease, and a multitude of other factors influence that health behavior of getting the vaccine or not. And having that common language is helpful because then we can analyze different situations or conversations they're in of, oh, this person that you were talking with maybe had a concern because they don't think COVID is a risk and they think it's not a big deal. And that's why they don't think they should get a COVID vaccine versus someone else who's scared of COVID, but maybe also worried about the vaccine. That's a totally different conversation. So I find it helpful to have common language for people to kind of analyze why do people think the way they do? Why do I think the way that I do? So personally, I like using theories in teaching. I don't go into too much detail if I'm just doing a session with a disciplinary course. I explain the theory and then we kind of talk about how to apply it. But I find it a helpful tool personally with my teaching. Any other thoughts on that before I try to answer another question or two? I'm gonna take on another Question, what are some good ways to include inclusive science communication into unidirectional modes of SciComm, like podcast videos or asynchronous modules? Great question, because a lot of inclusive SciComm, we talk about trust and interpersonal conversation and identity. Well, what if we are making a bigger tool like a podcast? How do we make that inclusive? And I think helping students recognize the importance of representation and co-creation can be really helpful. So during COVID, the Washington State Department of Health did a really cool project. They were trying to help different people who lived in Washington from different backgrounds understand the COVID vaccine. And they did focus groups with, for example, they're trying to increase teenagers' vaccination rates and uptake. And they did focus groups with teenagers, and they co-developed messaging that they then put on like social media and things. So it went widely disseminated, but it started with interpersonal conversations with members of that group they were trying to reach about what do you value? What do you think would be effective messages? And so that could be part of an assignment. Maybe if students are trying to connect with a particular audience, think about, am I a member of that group and what does that group value? And if I'm not, maybe I should partner with someone who is a member of that group, or if I'm trying to talk with, people who recreate in forests about tick-borne disease. That's another project I'm doing right now. I should talk with people who recreate in forests and about some of their concerns and knowledge gaps, or what they do know, and not make assumptions. And so engaging students in the idea of message planning based on working with members of a community, I think, is a way to infuse those inclusive elements. Trying to think, there's so many good questions in here. Okay, maybe this is a good last question. What is a take home from today that we should be sharing for people that are hesitant and perhaps overwhelmed to start, but want to dip their toes? I think that's a great question. And if there's anyone else that wants to answer as well, I think maybe take one of the theories we talked about today and think if you can put it to help you build a science communication lesson. Maybe you talk with your students about planning their behaviors in science communication, and that's your takeaway for today, and the importance of planning. You could do a small thing and add that, and I think that's a way to get started, that you don't have to be an expert on every single theory. I'm not, but you can get to know the literature on a few theories and utilize those, and then you'll slowly kind of evolve your repertoire of those.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much, Nicole. So that is all the time that we have. So we want to make sure that we're respectful of everybody's time. But thank you so much for attending this first talk. The network is really excited to bring in more researchers and practitioners as our talk series continues. So feel free to share this event with anyone who's interested. Our next talk is going to be on May 19th, and we're going to hear from strategic communications researcher Dr. Heather Aiken from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln on the science of science communication and how those findings can inform science communication education. So remember, if you'd like to be added to our email notifications of network events, you can follow this QR code or link, and we will keep you in the loop. Have a great week, everyone. Okay. Great job, team. Oh, hello. Hey, Alberto, he's still here. All right, I think we can go ahead and end.